Christopher Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and this is a quick presentation about happiness and the economics of happiness. The first thing to say is that economics actually is all about happiness. We talk about maximizing our utility, and the utility really is just well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, call it what you will. And it's a shame that over the years, the word utility has come to mean almost the opposite of what it originally meant when Jeremy Bentham was talking about maximizing utility in the utilitarians. It now seems rather kind of cold and practical, whereas actually what it originally meant and should mean is rather warm and fuzzy. It's about making the most of your life, enjoying your life, and each person can do that in their own different way. But economics is very much about happiness and well-being and trying to maximize all that. Can we study happiness? Well, Bentham nearly sent himself mad trying to make mathematical calculations for that. But what we tend to do these days, and there have been studies going back many decades looking at happiness, is we just use surveys. We just ask fairly straightforward questions, usually on a scale of 1 to 10. Here's a very common one. Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? Feel free to answer that in your mind. A similar one, which gets similar but not identical results, is overall, how satisfied with your life are you nowadays? Again, on a scale of 1 to 10. Sometimes it's a scale of 1 to 7. But again, answer that in your own mind, and I'll show you what most people think. So in the UK, we've been measuring happiness since 2011. And the general picture is that things have been gradually getting better over the course of those 9 years or so. This is the list of results showing the happiness scores. So this is the answer to the question of how happy did you feel yesterday? And you can see it basically works out as a mean average of about 7.5 out of 10. But you can also see the distribution. You can see that about 40% of people give it a 7 to 8. That's the most common scores. Quite a decent number of people get a score of 9 to 10. Very few people low down, and you get a few people saying 5 to 6. Pretty similar results if you look at the life satisfaction scores. You can see that they're very slightly higher, generally, life satisfaction than happiness. For one reason or another, I think that people can sort of be slightly more objective, if you like, about life satisfaction than they can about happiness, and happiness changes more day to day, whereas life satisfaction is probably more of a constant. But again, you get pretty similar scores. They have grown very, very slightly over the course of the decade. But with life satisfaction, you can see that just over half people give themselves a 7 to 8. If we look at the distribution, this data is getting on a bit. I haven't been able to find this particular graph shown in any of the more recent ONS data sets. But as you've seen, things don't change very radically with happiness scores, generally speaking. And you can see that the most popular score is 8 out of 10, with around about a third of people saying that, followed by a 7, followed by a 9. A surprising number of people give themselves a 10 on this. And the very low scores, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, very small number of people saying that, fortunately. This graph here shows us the slightly different results you get when you phrase the question differently. So you can ask about happiness. You can ask people whether they think their life is worthwhile, again, on a score of 0 to 10. And you can ask about life satisfaction. You can see that actually the happiness scores tend to be the lowest, followed by life satisfaction scores, followed by, at the top end, is your life worthwhile? And again, I think this is partly because it's a little bit more objective about whether you think your life is worthwhile. And also it's slightly detached from happiness. You can not be particularly happy yourself, but still think that your life is worthwhile. For example, if you're looking after older people or children. And again, you see that over the course of the decade, the lines are being ticking up, but you have to look at what what's on the y-axis there. We're talking about fractions, really. We look at the difference between men and women. You can see that, generally speaking, women, in the UK at least, are more satisfied with their lives. They are more likely than men to say their life is worthwhile, and they're more likely than men to be happy. But they're also, interestingly, more likely to be anxious. And then if we look over the course of a life, this is looking, I think, at life satisfaction. You can again see all the scores here, basically between 7 and 8, sorry. And what you see is there's actually a decline in happiness or life satisfaction as people get into middle age, and then as people get towards retirement and beyond, the happiness tends to increase again. In fact, it peaks actually roundabout in your 60s and 70s, and then it declines a bit after that. There are various reasons for this, insofar as we can discern them. But people tend to be a little bit less happy actually when they've got children, when they've got young children. But when their children get a bit older, they tend to get a bit happier. And in very old age, people are suffering from chronic pain and things like that, loneliness very often. And so you see life satisfaction going down. But again, we're talking, relatively speaking, we're talking fractions. We're talking really about the difference between 7.5 out of 10 and 7.9 out of 10. Now, if we compare internationally, Britain is pretty much average. This is yet another question here. Imagine an 11-rung ladder where the bottom represents the worst possible life for you and the top represents the best possible life for you. On which step of the ladder do you feel you personally stand at the present time? This question, a little bit different to the other ones, insofar as it's asking you to sort of imagine what your best possible life could be. Therefore, people are very unlikely to say a 10, I would suggest to you. We see some remarkably similar results across the Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries, and also Switzerland, exactly the same score, weirdly enough. But when it comes to Britain, you can see it's just in between Chile and the Czech Republic, just below the United States, but above Mexico. And then you've got some of the poorer countries, basically, Southern Europe, Turkey, Eastern Europe, where the scores tend to be a little bit lower. This was 2014 to 2016. So places like Greece were still suffering very much from the financial crisis. Now, one of probably the most famous study in the whole field of happiness economics is known as the Easterland Paradox. This was published by Richard Easterland in 1974. And the paradox is that, as you can see from the first table, people tend to be happier when they're richer, and they tend to be poorer. Sorry, they tend to be less happy when they're poorer. And there's 3 different points here, historical points, 1963, 1966, and 1970. And consistently, the people who were rich, which at the time meant having more than $15,000 a year, they were quite significantly more likely to declare themselves very happy than the people who earned a bit less than that. And the people who earned the very least were the least likely to declare themselves to be very happy. And the second table shows that between 1946 and 1970, overall, despite the fact that more people were earning more money, despite the fact that GDP was growing, there isn't really much of a change in the number of people who say they're very happy or indeed fairly happy. The number of people who are not very happy does decline a bit. But all in all, there isn't the relationship between GDP and happiness that you might expect. And this has been followed up by various studies subsequently and found in America, at least, a similar thing. And so this is the classic Easterland Paradox line I'm showing you here. You see that happiness, as defined in this instance by the proportion of people who say they're very happy, stays very, very flat throughout this whole period, essentially the second half of the 20th century. And yet average income and GDP is more or less growing constantly. You can see this in another study looking at life satisfaction. Again, the life satisfaction score in America remains essentially flat. Real GDP per capita is going up very significantly. And this has been interpreted in various ways, one of which is to essentially dismiss the importance of economic growth. And the Eastern Paradox is often cited by growth skeptics, or people who believe in a zero growth economy. And they argue that we should focus on other things than GDP. For example, reducing inequality, or focusing on social capital and whatever that might mean, or focusing on the environment. But they always come back to the argument that GDP doesn't actually make people's lives any better, and this is evidenced by the Easterland Paradox. A further piece of evidence cited by such people is a graph like this, similar kind of graphs to this, where we see that rather than just comparing what happens in one country over a period of time, if we just compare different countries, compare rich countries to poor countries, and look at the, in this instance, SWB index, which is social well-being. And here we see quite rapid growth in happiness, generally speaking. It's a pretty messy graph, but if you follow the line, it suggests that certainly there is a relationship between GDP and well-being, but it kind of hits a peak. You get diminishing returns, and some versions of this graph actually show it completely flat once you get to the kind of wealth seen here by the likes of New Zealand and Cyprus and Spain. What I think actually is most interesting about graphs like this is that if you look at the top left-hand side, which the author of this graph has pointed out is largely Latin American countries, but not exclusively, you can see that there are actually quite a lot of countries where there's a high level of well-being or happiness, but a relatively low level of GDP. So it's clearly possible for a country on average to be pretty happy, even when it's got fairly low incomes. But if you look at the bottom right corner, you can see there's nothing there. I think that's the main message I get from graphs like this. There's no countries that are rich, but not at least fairly happy. So although it is possible to be happy without very high GDP, it does seem not impossible. Clearly, these are just averages, but it seems very unlikely you're going to be particularly happy as a nation if you've got high GDP. So how do we explain the Easterland Paradox? I think there are actually three ways of explaining it, three ways of answering it, not all of which are necessarily mutually incompatible. We can firstly just look at what Easterland himself said in that 1974 study. He didn't really interpret it in the way that many people have interpreted it since. He just said that economic growth does not raise a society to some ultimate state of plenty. Rather, the growth process itself engenders ever-growing wants that lead it ever onward. And I think it's an important point to make about the so-called science of happiness, is that when you're just asking people on a scale of 1 to 10 to rate their own happiness, firstly, it's a bounded measure. You cannot, by definition, go above a 10. So somebody who would have been a 10 in the 1950s and has then got richer cannot possibly show that they're any more happy. And so when you're dealing with a bounded measure versus a measure, GDP, which is at least in theory infinite, GDP can double and double and double. A happiness score can't double and double and double. It's left between a fairly narrow bound. In addition, people can only imagine a certain amount of happiness. And people, when they're asked to give themselves a score between 1 and 10, what are they comparing it with? What actually is a 10? Somebody in the Middle Ages couldn't even conceive of the kind of prosperity and living standards that we have today. And so a 10 for them would be significantly worse standard of living than a 5 or 6 perhaps would be today. So we're judging it by our own past experience, by the experience and lifestyles of people that we know, or people who are around us, or maybe even just people who we think we can reasonably emulate. So somebody in a very poor country doesn't think they can reasonably emulate the lifestyle of somebody who's wealthy in America. So they set their standards significantly lower. So you're dealing with two very different variables. One, it can go up and up and up. The other, because it's a score that ends in 10, cannot go up and up and up. And what Easterland's saying is that we keep changing our horizons. You know, we get new ambitions. Doesn't mean that economic growth is pointless. It just means that human beings naturally want to achieve more and more. That's one way of answering it. The other way of answering it is to say it's actually wrong, that Easterland's finding just wasn't true, at least that it only really applied to America. And various researchers have looked at other countries and found that, yes, it's true that happiness doesn't keep going up at the same level as GDP, not least because it would be physically impossible for it to do so for the reasons I've just explained. But if you look a bit more carefully at the data, you can still see that happiness scores rise over time in line with GDP. In fact, I would say that the relatively limited data we've got from the ONS, which goes back to 2011, it does go up a little bit, not dramatically. It goes up a little bit, but that reflects us coming out of the Great Recession and GDP not growing very much, it has to be said, but nevertheless growing and incomes growing with it. So actually, there is a lot of evidence that's come out since 1974 that although there isn't a dramatic increase in happiness in relation to GDP, once countries reach a rich standard of living, there is still a correlation there. And this graph, this is similar to the one I showed you before, where the Latin American countries and the communist countries were highlighted. This is from a book called The Spirit Level that came out in 2009. They very much make the argument that the growth in happiness peters out once countries reach a certain level of wealth. And they explicitly make the argument that we shouldn't be focusing on GDP. We should focus instead on splitting up the pie and sharing it out more equally. And they use this graph to show it. And they claim that once you get to about the level of New Zealand or South Korea, there isn't really any point in generating more national income, because you're not going to generate any more happiness. They also make the same argument about life expectancy. The problem with that is that is also not true. I mean, they focus only on the richest countries in the Spirit Level. If we do the same thing with the richest countries using the same data, actually we can see that there's still a reasonably clear correlation with the richest countries tending to be the happiest and the relatively poorest countries tending to be the least happy. But one thing that they don't look at in the book, which is weird considering the book is all about why reducing income inequality would have a dramatic effect on all sorts of things, they never actually produce a similar graph looking at happiness and inequality. It seems like the obvious thing to do if you're going to start your book dismissing economic growth on the basis that there's no correlation between happiness and growth beyond a certain point. They don't do that. And I think the reason they don't do that is because there's no correlation between happiness and income inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient, or indeed by any other coefficient. There's just zero correlation between those two things, and indeed zero correlation over time. So here we see the USA again, and USA is perhaps the outlier on this. Perhaps the Easterland Paradox maybe holds water when it comes to the USA, even if not for other countries. But we see income inequality has been growing almost continuously in America for decades, and yet doesn't seem to have had any effect on overall happiness scores. And I think that's the important point about Easterland. If you take it at face value, nothing affects happiness. It's not that GDP doesn't affect happiness. It's just nothing that's happened since the Second World War has any effect on happiness. And so all the recessions and the wars and the inflation and the unemployment that's gone up and down, none of it seems to affect happiness. In which case, what's the point of studying it? Or at least what's the point in trying to get any policy proposals derived from the study of happiness? So income inequality isn't affected. Sorry, income inequality doesn't affect happiness, apparently, if GDP doesn't affect happiness, but nor does crime or anything else at the macro level. That, I think, is too pessimistic. Many other studies have actually identified fairly clearly the things that do affect happiness at the personal level. Here are some of the main ones: health, marriage, which is to say at least that divorce makes people less happy. Education, more highly educated people tend to be happier. Employment, or more specifically, unemployment is associated with unhappiness. Belief in God tends to be associated with happiness. In fact, if you look at the previous graph showing all those different countries, it's notable that quite a few of the Buddhist ones, despite being fairly poor, are more happy than average. Social capital, friends, trust, and so on. Good government and economic freedom. The question is, where does this get us in terms of policy? Most of this, I would argue, is pretty obvious. I think most people can tell without having to resort to the social sciences that being healthy is associated with more happiness than being in chronic pain, or that it's a good thing to educate people, or it's a good thing for people to be employed. In fact, of all these issues here, the only one which isn't really a priority for most Western governments is belief in God, and there's no way that the democratic governments would or should be trying to encourage or enforce theocracy on people. But the rest of them, these are just, it's fair. And marriage, I guess, as well, I suppose it's one thing, although some governments do encourage that in various ways through the tax system. But the rest of the stuff, the health, the education, the good governance, the employment, these are always priorities of government, because people know instinctively that it's a good thing to be healthy and educated and to have solid government institutions. And maybe not everybody appreciates the benefits of economic freedom, but many governments do. So it doesn't fundamentally change what we know about anything. It doesn't fundamentally change the way that policy should be formed. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with trying to study happiness or conducting surveys in which you try and get some kind of score for it. But the reality is that in normal Western developed countries, you're always really going to get a score between 9 and 10, between 7 and 8 out of 10. And it's only going to change very, very slightly. And it doesn't really change in the light of very many policy decisions at all. It has to be something really serious for happiness scores to be changed. So I don't think there's anything wrong with studying it, but the lessons that you get back from it actually are pretty obvious, because people actually know what the obvious things are which affect their well-being. Now, finally, I've mentioned that generally scores are going to be between 7 and 8. I've mentioned that it takes something pretty big to affect those scores. And the COVID-19 and the associated lockdowns are that thing. And it will be very interesting to see how the pandemic and the lockdowns affect overall well-being scores. We've got some early evidence from the Office for National Statistics. We can see here that in the first months of this is the first month actually of lockdown. So the lockdown started March the 24th, I think. And you can see that was associated with a notable dip in happiness scores. Didn't have much effect on life satisfaction and whether people thought their lives were worthwhile. I think that's for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But on their personal happiness, it did drop noticeably, perhaps not as much as you might expect, but anxiety certainly went up. And in fact, it went up in February as well, when people knew the coronavirus was coming. And having said that these happiness scores are always going to be between 7 and 8, actually, for the first time ever, probably, since we've been keeping this kind of evidence, we saw happiness go below 6.5 right at the start of lockdown. We also saw the life satisfaction go down, and even the worthwhile score, whether people thought their lives were worthwhile, dipped somewhat, and anxiety flew up. What you will also notice, though, however, is over the course of the following weeks, it grew back fairly strongly, albeit still remaining lower in the case of happiness, or higher in the case of anxiety, than it had been previously. But clearly there was a knock-on effect. It does, however, make you wonder what would have to happen for happiness to go below 6 out of 10. We're not talking on the margins here. A drop from 7.5 to below 6.5 is genuinely and statistically significant. But it was a very, very extreme situation. It's been a very extreme year. And yet even then, the happiness scores only dropped by, by 10%, essentially, or by one point out of 10. And this evidence from the ONS, unfortunately, doesn't start before the April. So it starts during lockdown, effectively. But you can see that these other factors you might associate with happiness, feeling lonely, feeling unsafe, and so on, they did decline as well as people either got used to lockdown or as the lockdown began to ease. It says lockdown begins to ease May the 10th. It didn't actually ease very much at that point. But a certain amount of resilience, you might say, in the way that these scores drifted down during the course of lockdown. And I'm sure we'll see more evidence on this kind of stuff in the years ahead. This study comes from Lancet Psychiatry, and it found that the prevalence of clinically significant levels of mental distress rose from 18.9% to 27.3% over the course of lockdown, or a month into lockdown. And we shall see what happens with the other evidence. We'll have more happiness and well-being evidence from the ONS over the course of the next few months. At some point, we'll have figures on suicides, which many people suspect have risen over the course of 2020. But we shall see what happens. But it's one of the rare examples of happiness indicators taking a notable jolt. I mean, you can actually identify, looking at the data, where the pandemic began and where the lockdowns began, but you can't normally do that. And that's really my point in closing, is that most of the lessons from happiness economics are really quite blindingly obvious. They don't lead to any real policy prescriptions that people can't work out without reference to the happiness literature. Nevertheless, it's still quite interesting. And even if it only confirms what we already know, it still has value. I put some book titles up here. We at the IEA have actually written quite a bit about happiness over the course of the last 10 years or so. My book, Selfishness, Greed and Capitalism, contains a chapter, I think it's chapter 7, about the paradox of prosperity. We've written the Johnson Ormerod book there about happiness. I've got a chapter in The Pursuit of Happiness, which also contains the article by Sachs et al., which looks at happiness in various different countries and shows that actually there is a relationship with GDP. And Jamie White wrote a great book for us called Quack Policy, which also has a chapter about happiness studies in it. You can probably guess from the title of that book what he makes of the happiness literature. But that's all I have to say about the economics of happiness. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoy videos like this, please do keep in touch with us, sign up to our email, and if you're able to, do donate us some money. But thank you very much. Take care.